Case Western Reserve University and conducted his postdoctoral studies at the University of Michigan. Dr. Berente is the PI for 3 projects funded by the NSF investigating the management of next-generation scientific research centers. He has contributed to a variety of projects associated with distributed collaborative innovation in multiple contexts and has studied information technology-enabled innovation at NASA. He has authored more than 70 peer-reviewed journals, and his work has been published in top journals, including MIS Quarterly, Information Systems Research, and
the network stuff. What I'm interested in a nutshell, is organizing for innovation. I've been a business school. I like to think of myself as an organizational scholar, not as a particularly faithful to any methodology or I tend to come from it from a social theoretical standpoint. But what I'm really interested in is innovation, right? How do innovative things happen? How do organizations produce innovations? How can one manage the production of innovations? And if you look at this over the course of my the last few years, I've done some research. My dissertation, of course, was on NASA and the organization of NASA and how they implemented digital technologies to form an ERP system. But I've been looking at the automotive industry. I looked at architecture, engineering, and construction industry. Right there you see a building. That's the building where I got my PhD, designed by Frank Gehry, all that kind of molten lava looking thing up there in the upper left. That's actually a building. It's a particularly innovative building, right? It required a lot of things that were new to the architecture, engineering, construction area. And right now I'm interested in next generation science enterprise. So not only with the data explosion, but computational science, high-end visualization, software, distributed, collaborative, the whole world is networked, right? This whole idea of next generation science, I'm very much interested in that. It's the primary focus of my research right now. But today, we're going to talk, again, fitting in this whole idea of organizing for innovation. There's a research group that I'm part of. And the reason I wanted to bring this, and we'll maybe talk about this if we have a couple of minutes at the end. The reason I wanted to bring this project to your attention, maybe the theoretical elements of it might not be particularly interesting to the audience here. It's probably a little and there's still a physical non. Question. We have a number of different studies looking at design routines. In this particular study, we want to talk about how digital intensive, how intense digitalism affects those design routines. So I have a question. How does it affect the routine? Right? Let's think about it this way. Does more digital products make it more standard, or does it give it more variability? I use a lot of digital products and have a fairly homogeneous standard product process, or am I going to have a widely varying product? What was that? Oh, well, what do you think?
Like, you would also get some flexibility in the range of products, right?
It's the range of processes. So you think that the things you do, basically, would you do more things if you had more computers, or would you do fewer things more standardized? There's like a group of people who talk about standardizing, or a group of people who talk about combination. I'm saying they do both. Any other opinions?
Just because digital is how you interact with. So, certain practices that would allow a worker to contribute, like, a comment about this group, like relatively easily, then you might see more engagement proceeding. But then I'm sure you're also going to see like more kind of reinforcing.
You're all using the same technology. So, all right, we had two answers. And those two answers both were, well, it depends, right? Or both, or whatever. I can't answer that question. People want the question. So here we are. We want to understand how these digital technologies kind of broadly, and people don't talk about this. Right? You're not talking about the effect of digital technology on organizational innovation. Whether it's cycling the innovation, whether it's enhancing the innovation. Should we just, would we be more innovative if we had just one tool that everybody used, everybody knew, we could go from there? Or are we more innovative if we have a whole bunch of different tools and let people have the whole, well, the answer is the jury's still out, right? We don't know. First of all, it depends on things. Some of the things it might depend on is different organizations. One organization may implement digital technology one way in the research perspective. Another organization might do it different way. There are certain organizational structures, right? You might think in terms of a network organization might enact those digital technologies different than, say, a highly centralized organization, right? If you think about it, a highly centralized organization may think this is how you use it. You might be reducing the variability based on of activity based on what's going on. Different similar environments. Maybe if you're in a really rapidly changing dynamic environment, one way, and then if you're in a very stable environment, the process a different way. And then there are the characteristics of the person and team. And I'm sure, and we were talking about interaction, we were talking about this, that. There are all sorts of things. And here's one of those domains that's very important in organizations that there's very little research on. And the reason that there's very little research on is because it's really hard. How on earth do you really dig into this stuff? How do you compare large data sets, large elements of data in a way that's meaningful and actually results? And there's a guy, Brian Benton, who's at Michigan State, who's probably the foremost expert, I guess, on organizational routines today in organizational scholarship. In a recent paper, he's pretty much saying, look, because of all these problems, answers to this sort of it depends question are still a long way off. Because we don't even have the tools and methodologies to really get at organizational routines in such a substantive manner, right? Well, so let's think about this. If we were to really try and understand organizational routines, we wouldn't look at just the activities. A lot of the stuff, people who have studied organizational routines just look at sequences of activities, right? And the problem is the sequence of activities is a fairly hollow thing. First of all, it doesn't take into consideration digital technology. Secondly, all digital technologies are not equal, right? So we enact them in different ways. They have different affordances. We enact them for different purposes. Sometimes we sometimes it's one person interacting with the digital technology. Other times it can be a team. It can be simultaneous. It can be asynchronous, right? So we have all these different elements, right? The routines are composed of different elements. Here's what makes it complex. This is why we don't have the tools. Think about it. You would have to not only look at the sequence of activities, you would have to look at the sequence of activities for all the components of it, right? And like I said, there are no tools. So let's think about it. Before we think about what our research project is today, let me just bring up this idea of requisite variety. And remember, the one thing I'm interested in is innovation. And my argument is this, that the complex world, a more complex process, a process that can do more things, will innovate more. This is a big assumption. A process that does, a routine that does very few things will innovate less. This is an assumption that I come to my research with. The reason I come to my research with this assumption is based on an old theory, the cybernetic theory. It's called the law of requisite variety. Right? It's made by Rosh Ashby, that's this guy right there. And he basically was looking at controlling of the system. He said that the state of the controller, if you're going to control a system, you need to be able to match the number of states, possible states that the system is. The controller has to match the possible states. The perfect example, an example I use in class, requisite variety is my favorite insight to teach people because I think people don't intuitively think about this, but it's like a football team. Okay? If I were to, by myself, stop whatever the Chicago Bears from scoring a touchdown, how could I do that? Right? There's one of me, there are 11 of them. They could easily, 2 people could hit me, there are 9 other people who could grab the ball and score a touchdown, right? So what would I have to do? I would have to do one of 2 things. One is I would have to reduce the variety at the disposal of Chicago Bears. I'd have to maybe create a tunnel where I'm in the tunnel. And maybe I would have to, create a machine that would bash them down. So they could only have one way to go, and the machine would bash them down and wouldn't score a touchdown. Right? That's reducing the variety of the controlled system. Chicago Bears are the system I'm trying to control. I would reduce the variety that they can do, so now I can control them because they all have to go through the tunnel. That's one strategy. Another strategy to matching the variety is, well, you need 11 really big dudes, all right? And that's my defense. Now, theoretically, my number of states can match their number of states. So as long as everything else is equal, my 11 people defending the Chicago Bears should be able to keep them from scoring a touchdown. So I can do one of 2 things. I can reduce the complexity of the controlled system, or I can increase the complexity of the controller. Right? So if I increase the complexity of the controller, I can realize more states, I can be more innovative. So that's kind of the key assumption I'm making as I go to this research, is the assumption of requisite variety. And now I'm going to put a little bit of meat. Given requisite variety, what I want to say is that if my routine has more of a variation, more variance, we're calling it configural variation. Don't worry about it. There's more of a, unless you're interested in discussing configural variation. The reason we call it configural variation is we want to differentiate from sequential varieties, 2 different measures of variety. But the idea is that different combinations of these in a routine are going to afford me different states where I can considerably be a little bit more innovative. Fewer of these, I'll probably be less innovative, is my argument. That's an assumption we're bringing. That's an assumption that holds, but we could probably argue with it. But given that assumption, now I want to narrow down my question a little bit and say, okay, how does the digital intensity of the routine affect the configural variation of the routine? Right? Basically saying is, does digital intensity where it is? I'm looking at this question. And I want to look at it under different conditions. In an organizational context, with different structures across organizations, and in different environments. So we want to first, with our number of hypotheses we developed, first hypothesis is this. We just want a very blunt hypothesis in the overall relationship. And we base this And we talked a little bit about this, when you say you can do both. Zuboff, 1988, had this idea that information technologies can do two things. It can either automate a routine or an activity, or it can informate the activity. Automate means it'll standardize it, make it homogeneous, make everybody do what they want. You're reducing the variation. Informate means it kind of enables and informs the people and enables them to do more than they otherwise would. So we're basically saying that there's the overall relationship between digital intensity and configurable variety is going to be one of two. It's either going to be amplifying, we're going to call it the automate hypothesis, which is it reduces the variety, or we're going to call it the informate hypothesis, which is the technologies. Right? So those are kind of the two overall relationships, and then we're going to get into the context. When we look at, and if you think about it, there are two different structures we can think of, and that's more or less centralized. And there are two different environmental states that we can look at, which is more or less volatile environments. So those, and within those, there are different sorts of organizations. And there's stable hierarchical organization, dynamic hierarchical organization, stable network, or dynamic network. And that's how we're looking at our organization. And our second hypothesis is basically going to say, within an organization, routines vary less than between organizations. They're going to vary more between organizations. So organizations matter, right? So the first thing we're going to do is look across organizations. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at organizational structures. We're going to say that centralized organizations, right? And this is because of the nature of centralized organizations, command and control. We would expect less variation in a centralized organization than we would in a network or decentralized organization, right? So that's our third hypothesis. It's less centralized, you're going to get more variation than most. And then we're going to look at environment, right? Dynamic environment versus less dynamic. Not very dynamic. So less volatility and more volatile environment. We're basically going to say, again, coming from that basic law of requisite variety, that a more volatile environment is going to require more states. Right? So you're going to have more variation and more volatile rather than less volatile environments. Okay? So those are our hypotheses. So we can talk about this, but if you remember Pentland, so this is all based on requisite variety. But if you remember Pentland said, well, we're still a long way off thinking about this. Oh yeah. So now we're going to get into yet another thing, right? We want to talk about this whole idea, and this is if you think about me and the Chicago Bears, right? There are two different modes of me defending the Chicago Bears. Right? One is I can reduce the variety of the Chicago Bears. I can reduce the variety of my environment, reduce what I'm attending to just the person coming down in the middle of the aisle as my machine stops them, right? Or I can increase the complexity of the controller. I can put 11 people or 22 people, right? Then I can really stifle them, right? I can increase the complexity of the controller. We're going to call the one variety reducing. We're going to call the other variety amplifying, right? Increasing the number of states in the controller, reducing the number of states the controller has to pay attention. So if we look at our four different contexts of organizations, there are two that are matching. And we're not going to pay attention to these. We call these matching because the variety of the controller probably matches the variety of the organization. So think about it, or of the environment, right? So a more centralized, less volatile environment, right? You're going to have more centralization, less volatility. The more centralization kind of matches the less volatility. If it's a more volatile environment, less centralization will enable local actors to kind of match the volatility of the environment. So we're basically saying that less central and more volatile kind of matches requisite variety, right? It's me getting 12 Chicago Bears, or the 12 defenders or 20 defenders to address 11 offensemen, right? This is, oh no, more centralized. I'm just going to focus on my one little tunnel. For less volatility, one person walking down the tunnel at a time. In both cases, it's matching, right? Now here's a situation where I forced them to come down the tunnel at one time, but I have 20 defenders or something like that. What I'm doing is I'm amplifying. I'm creating way more situations of variety or the potential for variety in a less volatile environment. But I'm using a networked organization in a very stable environment. Right? Similar, and I call that amplifying. You actually have more variety in the controller than you do in the environment. Right? So it should be very innovative. Then there's variety reducing. which is a highly volatile environment, what I'm doing is centralized structure. So what I'm obviously doing is taking a picture of that environment. So those are the ones that I think are interesting, amplifying and reducing. What we want to do is compare amplifying to reducing products, right? So in an amplifying context, digital intensity will positively impact routine variation, and in reducing contexts, it will negatively impact routine variation. You're reducing the complexity of your algorithm to automate. So those are the hypotheses, all based on requisite variety, and all based on this very blunt view of digital artifacts and configural variation. And again, configural variation is sort of our proxy for derivatives. So now we're going to talk about the approach. And the approach essentially involves going and interviewing and observing processes. Okay? So that's what we do. We go out and look at design processes, see what people are doing, observe meetings, talk to people, interview them, and take the data down and have it transcribed. Right? Sometimes we can look at trace data. We don't have to. But either way, what we end up doing is coming up with a model of what we just saw. And we look at the entire design process. So we start with initiation, we conclude with some sort of delivery mechanism. And to apply. We have to do the whole thing. So it can get very time-consuming to build this, but that's what we do. And if you look at it, if you remember the different elements of the process, there are the actors, there's the activity, there's the digital technologies, there's the direction of the data, there's the importance of the digital technologies. All of these are modeled in our visual image. And we use a product called MetaEdit to do this model. And it's a tool for essentially for notation. It's developed to do meta-level notation for methodology. So the idea is that you can visually create your own notation. You can take the data from that notation very easily off the data. And then what we do is we validate. After we create the models, we go back to the original place. And we meet with people, interview them, and have them go through it, see if we missed anything. We go look at the data and make sure we're consistent with any trace data, we validate with interview data, and back and forth. So it's very time consuming, it's intensive. But then after we validate it, then what we do is we sequence it. We take it out of the metadata, we take the graphical data that we put together, and we make 7 tuples in genetic sequencing software. Okay? This is the same software that's used by biologists to, say, sequence proteins and nucleotides and things, right? And what we're basically going to do is it's called Clustable TXY, right? And it's based on Clustable G. There are all these Clustable softwares that we use in biology. This is one that we adapted for organizations. And by the way, all of these tools are available on our website if anybody's interested in tutorials and all that sort of thing. I'm not going to get too much into it, but basically what we're doing is we come up with distance scores and similarity scores, just like they do with genetics. So really, if you think about our tools, we kind of go, our website is orgdna.net, and our whole idea is we're looking at the DNA of organization. So we're using the same genetic sequencing. We look at our, and then of course, we go back and validate that. So that's what we do. We're looking at things like, I guess one of the most important things we do is, and I'll talk about this here in a minute, is look at alignment, right? Much the way they look at alignment. So that's how we're looking at alignment between the genes. They share essentially DNA. So we picked 4 organizations, right? We found an organization that fits each of these criteria. And we looked inside of those organizations. We looked at projects. We looked at design routines in those projects. These are the number of interviews for each project, associated duration of involvement. Basically, so we have a software development organization, which is here, or it's a less volatile, it's the automotive industry, and it's a less centralized. It's a really very distributed organization. We have semiconductor organization here, so it's a very volatile organization with very hierarchically centralized control, right? And then we have a parts manufacturer here, so it's a very distributed organization, a very volatile situation. Oh wait, no, actually alpha. Let's get that because mislabels. But the data has the right alpha, betas, and gammas. This has the right alpha, beta, and gamma. This table has some. So I'll update the table sometime. But the point is, this is what we did. If you remember that image that we created, for each activity in the routine, we look at the elements, and there are a number of states each element can be. Right? So there's a number of states that the actor can be. It can be an individual actor, it can be a number of actors. There's a number of states, and we looked at the different types of activities in the design context. So there are like 5 different types of activities that we might have. And theoretically generated these types of activities. You can see generating a design could be communicating a design, it could be approving. You know, there are different things that you can do in design. Location, this is either co-located or distributed. There's the tool. This is where we have the actual digital tool. There's affordance. This is, you know, there are a number of affordances that we took into the representation analysis, so on and so forth. Data flow, whether it's the directionality of the data, whether it's going one way or the other. All right, so what we have here, the artifact is actually the type of digital artifact. The tool is what element of the digital artifact we're using, and then what it affords, and then the activity. So the activity, tool, affordance, and artifact, those kind of create if anybody here is interested in the whole socio-material discussion versus socio-technical discussion, that's where we get at. They actually are publishing this as a socio-material that the methods piece to this. We just got accepted at MIS Quarterly, and they actually called it a socio-material sequencing method. And that whole idea of the affordance and the artifact, I'm sorry, the artifact of the tool is the invocation coming from the artifact. The activity and the affordance is the invocation from social context. So if anybody's interested in that, that's kind of what I'm. But so we take these different elements of the socio-technical and what we do is you place them over. Right? You have all those different settings for each of these. You place them in order. Then you create a meta routine, which is essentially sequences of those routines. Meta routine 2, another customer. And what it does, right, is we come up with similarity matrices, we come up with distance scores between these elements, and then you take some function of the inverse of those distance scores, right? You weight them, and then you various algorithms essentially alignment scores that tell us to what degree one routine overlaps with another routine, right? So they're very blunt alignment scores. So that's what it looks like. And if we compare E1 to E2, you look at this slightly different shades of color. Those two are aligned. There are also complex routines where within a routine you can have multiple affordances, for example, multiple we built all of this. And it just run you through what the hypotheses were and what the results we found were. I guess the first, which is kind of interesting, a very blunt one, which is, all right, without context, without anything, more digital intensity, what does it do? Do we get more alignment or less alignment among routines? And in general, we get more alignment. So our argument is it's generally automated. Right? Digital intensity tends to make design routines homogeneous. The fewer digital tools. So it's, again, very blunt, not the highest, it's significant, it's not the highest relationship, but we are basically saying that in general, visual technologies tend to reduce the variation. That's the overall plan. We start unpacking a little bit. We do find that routines vary less within organizations than they do across organizations. And that's what we found there with the airlines scores. Okay. With each organization. And then we looked at centralized versus network, and we found that centralized had far less variation, right? They're far more aligned than networks. So networks have more variation, which is what we expected. Right? So that fits requisite variety, like centralized structures have less variation. And then we look at volatile. Sure enough, volatile environments have more variation than less volatile. So looking at alignment is kind of the inverse of volatility. And then we look at amplifying versus reducing contexts, right? And the way we did this is we actually spelled out, we looked at all and this we kind of did as a visualization. I looked at it visually, eyeballed some regressions that I want to use. But the first thing, the top line is variation, bottom line is digital intensity. So you can kind of see that they move together in inverse four different cases, right? And then what we did is we compared these. We were particularly interested in these settings, right? So we compared them to the matching logic in each of those situations. So for example, if we look at the two less centralized, we found that matching, there was no real relationship, but for reducing, I'm sorry, for amplifying, remember it was less centralized, so we expect to be less volatile. If you had a network situation, you would have positive effect. Similarly, what we found is that in more centralized contexts, we're doing variety reduced. Again, in the matching, there was no relationship. So, and that was in the short term. If you look in the long term, what we did too is we're starting to play around here. We're starting to see that there's actually a inverse relationship. An eyeball, but it might cancel it out over the whole routine because of what happens at the tail effect. So if we start slicing and dicing it in different places, we'll get different relationships. So, and that's kind of the next step. We do some post-hoc analysis. We're going to dig into the qualitative work and we're going to feed back to that qualitative work and see, all right, why is it that in some cases it's a direct relationship between variety and so I guess the conclusions of this work are that in general, digital intensity, like in an overall very blunt manner, it's primary automation work. It's going to reduce the variation in that. Okay? You're going to have less variation within organizations than between them. You're going to have less variation within more centralized contexts than in decentralized contexts, right? In volatile environments. So this is the one thing that was a surprise. Volatile environments have less design routine variation. I think I just spoke when I was talking about the results of the book. So that's kind of a question we're running into. We actually find that volatile environments have less design variation than
And that's a great response to like volatility creates more uncertainty, and so in the effort to reduce uncertainty, that processes and routines are streamlined.
they're not matching.
Yeah.
They're reducing. Yeah. So, and that looked at our results. More volatile environments, negative relationship. Variety reducing contexts, right? We tend to automate. Variety amplifying contexts, we tend to automate. Matching contexts will mix the two. And that's what we see here, especially with this. This is a matching context. We're doing kind of an inverse relationship between the two here, and a direct relationship inside the context. So that's in a nutshell some of the analysis that we're trying to get at with this idea of design routine variation. We're using the theory, the law actually, it's called a requisite variety, to motivate some of that theoretical work, and that's kind of what we're doing. I guess the reason I wanted to present this is less for the theoretical implications, although I like it when people think about the term requisite variety. I think it's more about the methodology. And this is what I wanted to talk about briefly. We've got a team, Young Jin Yu
in probably listening are the PIs for a series of 4 NSF grants who have essentially developed this methodology. Started it when I was in my postdoc at Michigan, that got funded by their group. And then it was continued on by James Gaskin here, who has since gone to BYU there. And now we've got a set of other PhD students, 4 of them, and then we've got a biologist, right? Something else with the biology, which is and what we're doing is we're really building out this whole idea of a socio-technical / socio-material sequence. And what we're seeing, and there are a couple of PhD students in particular, who are really getting into network analysis. Aaron Lindbergh, right, and Zue at Temple. So Zue Zhang, right? So they're really getting into the analysis of social networks and sequence analysis. And they're doing things like open source software. They're looking at things where you can get sequence data and you can get network data. We're trying to combine the two. So one of the things we're playing around with is this is the next frontier, really, of, I think, sequence analysis, which is nowhere near as popular as social network analysis. It is used by an obscure set, and there are different ways than pure sequence, like genetic sequence analysis. There's also event-based analyses and other temporally oriented analyses that are out there. So this is just one. So there are all these temporally oriented analyses that are looking at sequences of activities, sequences of events, but they don't really fill them out cross-sectionally. They don't look at actors, they don't look at tools, they don't look at all the stuff that's in these sequences. So that's on the one hand coming from sequence analysis. Coming from social network, I think originally we said nodes and links, right? And what's happening in recent years is people are starting to really incorporate time. So there's not only multimodal networks and all that, but they're starting to incorporate time. In a couple of conversations I had today with people incorporating time in their social networks. So here we've got the time people incorporating cross-sectional stuff in their networks, like we're trying to do. Then we've got the network folks like you trying to incorporate some time elements. I would argue that these two are converging, and they're getting there. And that's what some of our students, especially Aaron and Zue, are really wrestling with because they're trying to be experts in both. They're trying to come up with ways to unite the two. Right? And one of the things I'm playing around with, and Lindsay and I just talked about this, is the idea of social structure. Right? If you really peel back anything we're saying about organizational routines, and you really peel back anything we're saying about social network analysis, both of them are essentially structural arguments. We're saying something about the repeated patterns of activity structure the future of repeated patterns of activity. And there are 2 elements of that. One is the relational structure, right? And one is the sequential structure. And I would argue that what you're getting at with social network analysis, more often than not, is relational structure. You're looking at the structure of relationships. So when we look at the formal structure of an organization, the hierarchy, we're looking at a relational structure. And when we look at the informal networks, what people actually do, and we map them out and look at a picture of it, we're still talking about relational. We're talking about the system, the context of the system. And then when we're talking about the events, the sequence of events that happen, we're talking only the pattern, the repeated pattern of sequence of events, the rules associated with those sequences of events. You know, this is more of a institutional or hidden sort of social structure. This is more of a, formal organizations, social systems view of structure. So it's a systems view. This is a structurational view. But what we're starting to see is that we can't keep these conversations separate anymore. And this is one of the things that we're saying is that relational social structure and sequential social structure are coming together. They're recursive, they're mutually constitutive, they're interesting together, and we've generally treated them separately these last few decades of educational scholarship. Now, the last 5 years and going forward, maybe starting in 2008, we started identifying papers that are trying to treat the two together, although they don't necessarily say it that way. And that's where we're going forward. And that's kind of the next frontier of our collaboration. So if anybody's interested in doing that, we run the students that already run the questions that are really both the sequential and the relational structures together. The rest. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
So I kind of presume that you look, you dwell on Philadelphia's work?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Which work? What reason?
Well, like practice theory and kind of, and I think that might, in the way that she talks about how the routines and practices and technologies and organizational settings kind of inform to larger systems of work. It seems to be like that.
Well, when you work in a business or in an organizational context, right, like contemporary organizations, they're always using the term business process. There's the order to cash process, there's the fulfillment process, there's the this process, that process, right? The design process, product development process. And they're always talking about process. Organizations are increasingly process focused. So if you step back and look at it sort of from a social theory standpoint, what is that? When I say fulfillment, what is it? I would argue it's an institution. Okay? It's got a name. It's a sequence of appropriate activities. It varies, it adapts, it'll evolve over time. It's an institution. Institutions are nested in other institutions. It might be part of a broader institution, market-based capitalism, whatever, right? But institutions are always nested, so they're fundamental. So business processes, I would argue, are institutions. Institutions are essentially social structure with a name. We talked about this briefly. So in that sense, and actually I mentioned Brian Pevin, some of his work on routine is actually very explicit in structuration. He's got this idea of an ostensive and a performative element of routine. The ostensive is the apparent, the structure in a sense, and the performative is in a sense the agency, how it's actually done, and then the two inform each other. So he actually makes a very structurational argument within routines. There are other people who kind of take different tacks. I took a slightly different tack than that on my dissertation. But yeah, so Vanda's work is there. It's not necessarily front and center. It's there. Yeah, if you're interested in the idea of routines at all in relation to social theory, but he really talks about within organizations and routines. Period. He's not talking about society broad structure. He's not talking about communities broadly. He's talking about organizations. Right? So there's this whole once you're now in the box, micro organizational. Right? Balance of an institution, market-based capitalism don't really matter because you're in and now it's kind of a sub-institution. And the pictures up here, of course, I showed you that, and that's kind of the distance on the different routines.
When you sample the organizations, you picked 4 prototypes, essentially, right?
Theoretically sampled organizations,
which is
sampled for their variety. Based on those.
I'm just wondering, like, more realistically, like, organizations are probably hybrids of all of those, So, I mean, teasing out those organizational effects is difficult, so I'm wondering if we should work to look at more. I mean, you might not be able to get into some experimental fashion, but being able to see that, like situations when the, like structure, or when the organizational structure matters, or for whom, especially like when you think about like an organization that has like a really strong hierarchical like structure. For whom does that structure matter more or less in terms of the way that they use with technologies and the way they form their routines?
Yeah, so I mean, your point is really there's no objective centralization and decentralization. I mean, I could probably tell you which firms they are. So, for example, more centralized, more volatile. They're extremely centralized, extremely like not a lot of these groups. More centralized, or so less centralized, less volatile is the architecture. You pick an architectural contractor, right? And they're incredibly distributed, but it's not a particularly volatile environment, right? And then we have more centralized, less volatile. That's what I messed up when I was going there. That should be a part time. But it's a very centralized bureaucratic tradition. They're making hydraulic valves. And then we have our very volatile because it's software and it's distributed. Now it's Ford Motor Company, but it's their software, which is very distributed. So you see that, and you see some of the complexity within it a little bit, like especially at Ford. Right? That's one of the interesting ones. But what you're saying is true. It's not so much that that's objectively, centralized, but we would argue that it's less centralized. It's definitely less centralized on the top. It's less centralized on the top. Okay. Similarly, both the software world of Ford's software development and the semiconductor world of Intel is way more volatile than architectural office buildings. So from a relative standpoint, both of these are going to be more volatile than both of these. Both of these are less central. And we have that in our interview data. We can very justify this. But yeah, Intel compared to someone who's very demanding control, maybe Intel compared to Berente, maybe Intel is less centralized. Yeah, it's tough. And there are different elements of a big organization like Ford that are decentralized with their software development. Other elements of Ford, like the product development, is more centralized. So depending on which design things too. So we kind of brought that into there.
I mean, like, so if you're talking about, if you're interested in, kind of these institutional effects, like a design team designing valves versus like a design team design, like doing one graphic design, like the work itself creates culture like that might influence like how they go about engaging with these people.
Ideally, so kind of a next step for this would be to pick Ford as the software.
Yeah.
All right, and then you run into this compounding issues there too with the model softwares. So there's always that. And here, we sampled based on organizational elements. And because of the volatility element, we couldn't pick the same time. Right? So that's why we're just kind of sort of controlling by using a 2x2 comparison. Right? So when we talk about central versus less central, we're taking two more, two less, comparing them. And actually within the paper, we actually looked at it in. Like this central versus that central, and then these two central versus these two. So we did a lot more comparisons to kind of show that this difference is more valid than. But yeah, there's an issue there. And it's not an experiment in the sense that we have control. It's a theoretically sampled, tested. And that's how we do that. Yeah, that's kind of, if I had to say there's the Achilles heel in a sense, this study, that's what people can. I hope they like the rest of it. So one of the ways is relations into the sequence. That creates a connection. One way where we can naturally do similar patterns. For example, pattern function. And so in that sense, it's a very popular system of sequences. And it's more compact manipulation. And actually, sometimes the difference actually indicating the level of manipulation among sequences. So basically, introducing correlation into the sequence analysis actually destroy the pattern. Like so in that sense, assuming the piece of sequence is standalone. Going to perform based on the own driving force. And it's pretty hard to explain. Oh, heck yes. It's pretty hard to get your head around how it's going to work. And yeah, they constitute each other. Pretty much what you're saying there is that the shape of the relational method is going to influence the shape of the sequential method. Similarly, I would argue that the shape of the sequential method also, with the appropriate activity, is going to dictate who content, right? Who you work with, the rules of action. Is going to kind of, so the two constitute each other, right? The relational network shapes to a degree, and then which one comes first? Who knows? And there's where the institution's going. If I would start an organization full clock right now, I would probably adopt the fulfillment process that's embedded in my information technologies, which are find its roots in the, institutions of any other form of best practices. So it's built into the systems, and now I would adopt that as my default. So my routine would already be shaped by some existing functional order, which would dictate my relational network in my organization to some extent, and then it would adapt over time. My relational network shifted as necessary. It's hard to, that's some of the issues. Yeah, it's kind of definitely we won't be able to make that anymore. Another similar function that is very technical. So basically, suppose you have two types of sequences. You calculate distance between the sides, and that into the one of them is in general the distance among what method kind of that's the cluster. That's the cluster. It's a distance. So so the first thing you do is straighten the distance. You take the 7 people compared to each other. That creates you a design score. Then the way you create an alignment, which is what we use for analysis, is it's the inverse of the Euclidean distance score plus adjustments. And those adjustments, pushing at it, but one of them includes a weight. Right? So you look at the total analysis, you look at distances and relative distances, and you weight that so that it's relative to the overall analysis. And then you get an alignment score where you can do so basically, normalize all those. Yes, your norm. It's exactly. That's what the weighting does. Is it normalizes the inverse. And then, so you have 10 signatures. You have two vectors. Right. Yeah. So it's pairwise all the way around. So you're asking me how those two vectors are compared, how it does all those pairwise comparisons and comes up with a plot. Interesting. Well, right. So this is suppose you have a 10 by 10, so this is the dimensional function. Another and then you have that of 400. And how to compare it with that of the normal analysis? Good question. I think that's what that's what the software is doing. That's the hard part. And there's another problem here because all those numbers are correlated. So for example, if 1.1 sequence is very different from the other, you are generating multiple very long distances. So that's not that. And then you somehow there's one outlier well, and that leads to yeah, that's why it might not be a straight weighting. Like when you said normalizes, it's not strict, right? They kind of account for that, so that if you look at the final plots, right? If you will, they're not. And what they'll do is they'll use the trees, right? The genetic trees, and that will be your results. If you have a genetic tree, you don't have distances going up the tree. So what it kind of normalizes that. So your outliers are brought in through the tree. So it's less of a, I guess, distance. That's why the alignment score is the inverse with the weight. The distance here, you have those kind of issues. The adjustments will bring them all into sort of an normalization. So the level of the idea is the tree, the genetic tree. So they want to, and at the bottom of it, you've seen genetic trees. At the bottom of it, distance. They don't really care about how far away a cockroach is from the human. They want to look at the percentage of the share as it relates to the percentage share. So we look if the distance is far, we don't want to show it. I'm sure it doesn't work. But I mean, if you're really interested in this, like, if you want to adapt it, I'm certainly not the person you're talking to, but I can. So I'm working on the paper with functions. So we have a function. But it's probably better with yeah, so that might be so cluster. That's what clusters do. And there are about 10 different versions of cluster software. So what I could do is after this, and then talk to any of our PhD students that can then do probably James. He's developed most of these tools. My engagement with this was getting the first couple of grants and then the theoretical segment, the different components of it. Building that out. James built the initial set of tools, and then now we've got Rob. Rob's our biologist. He might actually, he's a cluster expert, and he knows the tools, but maybe not as good as James, but good at that. So Rob would be another one you talk to. And then the 4 PhD students are right now writing extensions. There are tutorials online. There are examples online, and they're all really just getting really into open source stuff. They're all developers as a GitHub, so they don't know GitHub, just don't know all that kind of stuff. And they're like, so Aaron, his dissertation is in the social network projects that get doing sequence analysis. He's trying to figure out how to bring it through that. That's his dissertation. It's pretty hairy. Yes.
I'm thinking in terms of when the routine producing new system. So producing new institution. And so did you find like, so you have the example of a less volatile. So if, like, for example, I can't remember if we actually found this or not, but let's just say we found a situation where there was a highly centralized organizational structure, but either in the condition of high volatility or low volatility, it actually, the effect of more digital, it had a larger effect, let's just say, or there was more information going on. So in some ways, like,
more digital is more volatile in centralized world. So
yeah, I'm wondering if, like, in that situation, like, if you were to trace that over time, like, would you see the organizational structure change because more variety and more was being introduced?
Right. So the reason we brought in the biologist and young Vin, who's in the upper right there, is at Temple. The thing that they're really interested in is the evolution of proteins. So we will enact the valve design regime this time. And then we're going to have valve design regime next week. And we're going to enact the design regime next week, right? That's one of the things that is going around with this. How does it mutate?
It's not always
From,
reproduction.
yeah.
Sometimes it's like,
well, and it's mutation. The next time I do this routine, it will change. Inevitably. No 2 times is identical. So you always adapt to local contingencies. After you've reproduced it a couple dozen times, you have a fundamentally different, not necessarily a new institution, but it's an institution that's adapted to the moment developments of the routine that's adapted. So that's one of the things that's like the next frontier we're looking at sequential evolution. That's the big reason we brought that biologist in. Another comparing the evolution over time. So he's trying to get at that. He's not really in the social networking, and neither is the other things, but Aaron, actually, the team science thing is happening here, isn't it? So we wrote a paper with this relational and sequential thing, and he's presenting it. He might not be presenting a paper in that sense. If you wanted to discuss some of these things with Aaron, it's very governance and those. What is that? No. Yep. So anybody who's interested in thinking about the way these two come together, I'd be happy to talk more. And anybody's interested in the methods, let me know and I will direct you to all of their website. Thanks, everyone.